Hello and welcome to China Dispatches, the official podcast of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China that shares on-the-ground insights from business leaders and experts on doing business in China. I'm your host, Ray. It's a special day today. Exactly 2 years ago, we released the first episode of the China Dispatches podcast. One of our vice presidents and a colleague shared their experience of traveling to China from Italy and Hong Kong. I can still remember how painful they are, facing uncertainties over when and if they will be able to come back. 2 years have passed. COVID restrictions are still with us. The exodus of foreign nationals is underway. International travel is still an important topic for European businesses in China. In today's 2-year anniversary episode, we will revisit what it's like travel to China with our guest speakers having just returned to China a few weeks ago from Europe. So welcome Peter, Robbie, and Charlotte. Could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Peter Ling-Vannerus. I'm Chief Representative of the Swedish bank SEB here in Beijing, and I've been in China a bit more than 5 years. And I'm here with my family, 3 kids and a wife.
I'm Robbie Jarvis. I'm a Policy and Communications Manager at the Chamber, and I've not been in China as long as Peter, having only arrived about a month ago.
I'm Charlotte. I'm the Policy and Communications Coordinator at the European Chamber. I've been here for the past years, but since the pandemic, I went home for the first time this summer after 2.5 years of not seeing my family.
Thank you all for joining. Before we get to your experiences in detail, I'll briefly recap the policy updates of coming to China from Europe. So firstly, regarding tests, people, no matter vaccinated or not, need to take 2 PCR tests within 48 hours before boarding, instead of the previously required 1 PCR test and 1 IgM antibody test. And those who previously have been infected with COVID record no longer require a lung, X-ray, or CT scan. Secondly, about people who come to China for long-term or short-term work purposes, PU invitation letter issued by relevant government bodies is no longer required. Same apply to their dependents, family members. Thirdly, for students, those who are planning to study in China for over 6 months is able to apply for visas again. And those who already have valid student residence permits can use them directly. Same for holders of valid APAC business travel cards. Fourthly, regarding flights, people can choose to fly directly to China or transfer via third country or countries. Previously, people were only able to fly from third countries if their home countries didn't have direct flights. Also, China's aviation regulator relaxed flight suspension rules. A flight will be suspended for 1 week rather than 2 weeks as previously, if the number of COVID cases recorded on board totals 4% of the total number of passengers. And the flight will be put on hold for 2 weeks if the number of infections reaches 8%. And finally is the quarantine times. For international inbound travelers, the quarantine time was reduced to 7 plus 3 days, down from previously 14 plus 7 days. 7 plus 3 means 7 days of quarantine in a hotel, followed by an additional 3 days quarantine either at home or in a hotel, depending on whether they arrive in China in their city of residence or not. So from these policies changes, it looks like the restrictions have eased a lot. What's the real situations on the ground? Let's hear from experiences of our guest speakers. Robbie, we've been colleagues for close to 1 year, and I finally met you in person less than 2 weeks ago in our Beijing office. Why did it take so long?
Yeah, so I began working at the Chamber in mid-November, and I formally started my visa application process in October, and it's been quite the journey to get here. So in total, it took about 9.5 months to actually get my visa in hand and then finally arrive. So the real challenge really was getting a PU letter. I think in total this took 6 or 7 months. Initially, we actually thought I would be in China sort of around Christmas time. So it's been quite the delay arriving in August. Specific to the PU letter, you had to apply through the local city authorities. So we originally applied through the Beijing authorities, thought we'd get the letter in sort of 2 weeks, 1 month. There was a slight delay, and then we ended up encroaching on the period when the Olympics was held, and they stopped issuing PU letters, except for companies who pay very high tax rates, and for senior executives from large companies, of which I don't qualify. We then were told we could apply for the letter through the Shanghai authorities, and then unfortunately Shanghai had its own problems with the COVID outbreaks there, and they stopped issuing letters. And then finally, again, we were told we could reapply for a different Beijing department, who finally issued me the letter after several months. Aside from that, in terms of sort of the standard visa application process, applying with my paperwork once in hand, etc., at the embassy in the UK, my home country, that was fairly straightforward. There were some delays. The visa servicing centre is only currently open for 2 half days a week in the UK, meaning the processing times are longer, but it was nothing compared to the PU letter delays. And then finally, a challenge with getting out here was the lack of flights, which was also a real issue. So I formally had my visa in hand, I think it was end of June or early July. I managed to get a flight mid-August, but initially it was a real challenge. So there's a real lack of commercial flights. There's currently, or at the time, there was no flights from my home country, the UK, to China. And all of the flights that were commercially available had a large number of layovers, which didn't meet the sort of testing requirements with having to do a 48-hour and 24-hour before test, or transits via Taiwan, which I can't enter, making it really practically difficult. I was really fortunate actually to be able to get on a chartered flight, chartered by the Italian Embassy and the Italian Chamber of Commerce. That finally got me here, and it's great to finally be here and be able to talk to you today.
Yeah.
Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Finally.
Okay, Charlotte and Peter, unlike Robbie, you've been here, like based in Beijing for a longer time and traveled home during the summer. So before traveling back to Europe, were you worried that you might have trouble coming back? And what sort of preparation did you do before flying out and coming back?
We were, of course, quite worried, and many of our friends here in Beijing felt that the problems were just too big, so they chose to stay here. But I was actually personally back in Sweden last summer for a few weeks, but my family, my wife and my kids have not been back for 2.5 years. So we thought that it was worth taking the risk to go back to Europe to see friends and family after such a long time. And of course, immediately when we got to Europe, all of us got COVID, some of us more severely than others. But once that was over, it was very nice to be able to connect again with all the people we wanted to see in Europe. Going back is always quite stressful. The testing has to be done in certain orders, and we were leaving from France through Frankfurt using the German Chamber charter flight, arriving in Qingdao. And for 2 of us, actually, on the 4th test, we tested positive, which was a surprise after having tested negative 3 times. So we did a retest again, and then that was fine. The charter flight went all well, and then when we arrived in Qingdao, it was also quite smooth. But then again, one of us tested positive again and had to do retesting, and that is quite stressful because you don't know if you'll end up in a hospital for at least 7 days, and then you have to restart the quarantine process in hotel again. So it's quite a tense period before you have everything in place.
Wow, I can feel that. I'm so worried. Yeah. How about Charlotte?
So I was in a similar situation to Peter's family members. I hadn't gone back for 2.5 years, but my partner went back in the summer of 2020 and also the summer of 2021. Similar to what Peter just described, I just felt like, the risk is high, but it's so worth it. So we actually flew commercially with the Scandinavian Airlines, both from China and back to China. For me, I wouldn't say I was worried. I was more being realistic. I was really checking that all my paperwork were in order, that my visa was valid for a prolonged time in case of being stranded in Sweden. I also made sure that I took all my important papers with me back home. For us, it was more the circumstantial worry because we were flying out of Shanghai. And of course, when Shanghai went into a lockdown, we were quite worried. And then also restrictions started to tighten up in Beijing. So we were quite concerned in May whether we would be able to make it out of Beijing and go to Shanghai to catch our flight home. Luckily for us, our flight was the week just after Shanghai opened up. So we managed to go through it. And when we arrived in Sweden, the first piece of news we heard was that the pilots for the Scandinavian airlines were decided to go on strike. And then we were thinking, oh, hopefully the strike will be over by the time we will go back to China. But it kept on dragging on and on throughout the entire summer. And again, I think we were just lucky in the end because the strike ended 1 week before our return flight to China.
Do you want to elaborate more on what difficulties you encountered in Shanghai?
So the first difficulty was actually getting out of Beijing. At the time, Beijing had imposed sort of like a semi-lockdown of the city. Just getting the train ticket to start with, we really had to monitor carefully the train tickets, and we had to get in some sort of a reservation line to purchase the train tickets. So even though we were in this line, there's no guarantee that we're going to get a ticket. Luckily we did. And then there's also the testing requirements. So we had to do the 2 tests before leaving Beijing. One the day before and one on the same day. And we weren't sure we were going to get the results in time. So we tried to get the paper version of the test. So we had to contact with the test provider to download the PDF version of the test earlier than before the test requirement comes into the Jiankanbao or the health code in Beijing. We also needed to register for the Shanghai health code in the Alipay. For me, that was quite easy to do because I already have Alipay and I use it in my everyday life. But for my partner who does not have Alipay, it was a little bit of a hassle because he needed to download it and then re-register with the passport and set up the account and so on. It took some time and a lot of frustration at home. And once we had our tickets and we had our COVID tests and we had our green Shanghai health code, then we were ready to board the train. And that was pretty straightforward, going from Beijing South to Hongqiao Station in Shanghai. When we arrived at Hongqiao Station in Shanghai, there were a lot of controls, both for temperature, for the COVID test, for the code, and we need to fill in a lot of detailed information about basically stating that we did not intend to stay in Shanghai. We were transferring to Pudong Airport, but we needed to stay 1 night in order to make sure that we were catching the flight. And during our stay that night, we also needed to do 2 of the antigen tests, self-tests. We were given this test upon check-in at the hotel, and we needed to download kind of a mini program in Alipay and to take a picture of the test result and upload this test result. I didn't really know what it was for, to be honest, but I think it was a local Shanghai policy at the time. So anyone who came into Shanghai needed to do this because they didn't really check them when we were entering the airport. At the airport, they really only checked that we had the green code and the COVID test. And they wanted to have the paper. They actually wanted to take the paper from us. So I think there we were quite smart that we had managed to get it all on paper. So that would be my recommendation for anyone really flying in and out of China. Like, make sure that you also have the paper versions.
And that sounds complicated. We actually took the risk and we caught a plane in the morning the same day that we were leaving in the evening, and that all of our friends didn't do that, but we were lucky and it worked out fine. But it's true, it's a lot of tests and the timing is very complicated.
Yeah, I know some other people who also did that. I think because we were going in the second week or first week of opening up after the lockdowns. So at that time you couldn't fly to Shanghai. You had to take the train and then transfer to the airport. But now it's definitely easier, and next time I go home I expect I will be able to take the flight directly from Beijing.
It was risky. Half the flights were cancelled, and
yeah.
You never knew if you would get there. But
Yeah, Peter, you, as you mentioned before, you took several tests, negative and positive. So what's your take of your complicated process?
well, testing is stressful. It's very expensive. Some places charge more than 300 euros per test. And we're a family of 5, so have to do it 4 times at least. And frankly, it seems that many of these testing centers are not very serious. And of course, we've seen a number of scandals. So when you say that you test positive, so, oh, well, did you eat half an hour before, or did you do this and that? And then we can do another test, and then it turns out negative. So they're not very reliable, and I think you have to be very insistent to redo the test. I heard of 2 families on our flight who were coming from Hamburg, also 5 people, but they canceled the flight. You don't get any refund or anything, and it's very difficult. It seems to me that you cannot really rely too much on these tests, unfortunately.
Yes, testing is very expensive in Sweden and in Denmark. Actually, we spend more money on getting tested than we did on the quarantine in China.
Wow. So except the tests regarding like preparing the documents you need, so do you have any recommendation or like difficulties preparing this?
I think, like Charlotte said, you have to be very prepared and organized, and but still with a time lag. I mean, we're sitting once in France after midnight, uploading all the documents and making sure the test results were okay, and they sometimes don't arrive in time, so you need to contact the test centers and push them to send you the results. In the end, it worked out fine, but it's a lot of factors that are outside of your control, so that's why it's quite stressful to do this and to make sure that you get the green code in time to be able to leave your first point of departure. In our case, it was the south of France, and then to be able to prove that once you arrive in Frankfurt for more testing.
So it's really about be well organized and manage your time really efficiently, so that you can have all the preparation done for the flight.
Just add that in practice, so you have to get a health code, and you have to upload normally 2 COVID tests to receive the health code, and you have to do it in each point you transit in. So for me, I started my journey in the UK, had to do 2 COVID tests in the UK, upload them, get the health code, and then 2 in Italy where I transited. So the real challenge is the space between doing your tests and actually applying for the health code and then getting on your flight is really, really tight. So for me, my first flight out from the UK was at 6 a.m. I got my 24-hour test result maybe 5-6 p.m. the day before. So I was up at sort of midnight, 1 a.m. constantly refreshing the page to see that my Chinese health code had come through. And then for my flight from Milan to Nanjing, it actually got moved earlier. So the flight itself was at 1 a.m. So it was quite stressful actually waiting for the codes to come through, given there was such a tight deadline to get them. So I was in the queue at the airport, literally watching people wait for their health codes to come through while they were in the check-in queue. So I'd say one thing to do, which is really imperative, is to make sure that as soon as you get your codes or any issues, to constantly check to apply as soon as possible, as the process is really tight.
Wow. Do you have recommendation like how many hours between flights people need to leave? I think it can't be too long, it can't be too short, right? So do you think, is there a recommendation?
In terms of your flight to China, there's currently very few flights, so it's actually likely you won't have much of an option.
Yeah.
So from many countries, there's only like 1-2 flights a week, if that. So really, it's more a challenge of getting the flights. If you can, it's better not to take a flight very early in the morning for this reason. But in practice, you'd be lucky to get a flight. So it's more of a practical issue there, I'd say.
But one advice is, of course, that you should have enough time, because what you can decide is in your case, how early you leave from the UK
Yeah.
to Italy. You should have. In our case, we spent 2 nights in Frankfurt for the transfer to be able to do all the tests.
Wow.
So I also spent 2 nights in Milan, and I think if you tried to do tests on your day of arrival, that would be unnecessarily stressful in the sense that, if your flight's delayed, if there's any issues, it could be a real issue.
For us, actually, we did it on the same day. But I think because the route Stockholm, Copenhagen, Shanghai is quite well established, so we were actually advised by the SAS to spend at least 8 hours at Copenhagen airport in the transfer. So we took and also there are many flights from Stockholm to Copenhagen the whole day. But we took a flight around 11 a.m. from Stockholm to Copenhagen, arrived 1 hour later, went to the testing center at Copenhagen airport. You need to book an appointment slot in advance on their website and also pay for the tests in advance. Got our test done, and then we waited. I think we waited for the test result. We waited 3 hours. And then to upload the result and get the code, we waited maybe an additional 1.5 hours. It was quite quick in our case, but again, might just been lucky. And then at Copenhagen Airport, by the boarding gate, the airline has also set up additional controls to check all the documents. One thing that we had been made aware of, but I'm not sure it's very clear to everyone, is the China Customs Declaration Code. So which means that there is an additional code that you need to get before boarding the flight.
In the case of the German chamber flights, you need to have 2 tests on your point of departure, and additional 2 tests, and one has to be 48 hours, the other one 24 hours, from 2 different laboratories that cannot be connected at all. So it's a minimum of 4 tests. And if there's any delay and your last or first test is not recent enough, then you need to redo the whole thing.
Yes, it's the same requirement from Sweden and Denmark. But actually for us, the providers that we use to do the test, it was the same provider, but they sent it to different laboratories. And then it appears on the testing result as that you have done 2 different tests by 2 different providers. And it's the same at Copenhagen Airport.
Yeah. One point I'd just add is there's also specific information which has to be included on the testing certificate for lots of transit destinations. None of it is really radical. It's things like your date of birth, passport number, full name, test result, etc. But it's quite an extensive list. But I have seen that it does matter. So for me, when I was at Milan Airport queuing to check in, a lady behind me actually was missing one of the pieces of information, and her health code, it wasn't coming up as green, and she was on the phone frantically trying to get through to the Chinese embassy in Milan, or consulate in Milan, at 10 p.m. at night, trying to justify that her test result was fine. It was just that this kind of minor piece of information was missing. So I'd strongly suggest as well, if possible, that you check what requirements there are for the information and make sure that your testing center can just give you a test in that format.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend finding a testing center that has a history of working with clients that are flying to China, because they are quite aware of the different requirements for the test results.
I think one other thing I want to add is just to check the Chinese embassy's websites in those European member states, European countries. These sometimes have updates and will just enforce immediately, and there are sometimes changes to that. So while our listeners listen to all our advices, but we are just based on the experience we just had. So anything new update, just need to check on the official Chinese embassy websites.
Definitely.
Okay, now we have for the documentations and our flight tickets. Is there anything you would like to share that happened at the airport or on your way?
In Qingdao, the arrival, it takes a long time. More tests, of course, and more forms. But it was, and then all the luggage has to be disinfected, so it's completely soaked in some liquid once you receive it. But it takes a long time, and you just have to be very, very patient and fill all the forms that are required. But otherwise, I think it's okay, as long as you know that it takes a long time and you have something to occupy yourself with, and especially if you have children, you have something that they can do. It just takes a long time, that's all.
Definitely. You also need your phone for multiple processes, so there'll be numerous QR codes you're required, various WeChat forms, etc. you'll need to fill in. So you need to make sure that your phone has battery, that you have a smartphone, if possible, that you can have access to the internet both in your departure and arrival destination. And then also you would need WeChat for numerous processes. So if you're new to China, I'd strongly suggest you download that and you familiarize yourself a little bit with its interface and how it works.
I remember you had that problem of not having a Chinese mobile number. Why do you need that for?
Yeah, so a major issue I had in quarantine was actually accessing my health codes. So to travel in China, you need a health code for basically your city that you're traveling in. To get this for Nanjing, where I was quarantining, I needed to register via Alipay for an application. And I used my UK phone number to basically register for an Alipay account, and it was flagged up as a security risk. And it locked me out and said to re-verify, I had to do a 2-stage verification process, including adding details of a Chinese bank account in my name, which, having recently returned to China for the first time in several years, I currently do not have, making it impossible. So there was several days in quarantine whereby I was speaking to kind of the doctors affiliated with my quarantine hotel who were saying, you need to get this health code. And then I was saying, well, how do I do it? I can't register on Alipay. I don't have essentially a phone number. And yeah, it was a real major issue. In the end, I was very fortunate that our Nanjing chapter managed to actually purchase for me a SIM card and get it sent to my hotel. So real thanks to them, because honestly, it really saved me a lot of stress. But there was about a 3-day period where I was effectively in limbo. Didn't know if I'd be able to kind of get the health code that's required for me to, say, enter any hotels or restaurants once I exited my quarantine hotel.
Charlotte, anything interesting or anything stressful on the way here? We'll talk about quarantine parts in a little bit later.
No, not really.
Very smooth again.
Maybe odd one out, but I think our flight was the only flight arriving in Shanghai airport. So, which means that we weren't that many people at the airport. I remember when we landed, we were told to stay in our seats because they wanted people to disembark in small groups at a time. I guess to avoid long queues. So we had to wait for quite a while, and then we were getting off, and then there were just different stations. So you were moving between different stations the entire time. And it was a little bit sometimes too difficult to understand, okay, where are we going now, or what's the next step? But you kind of just followed the people in front of you, and everybody were helping each other. Because nobody really knows what's going on. So no, we didn't really have any issues with our arrival in Shanghai.
Okay, it sounds pretty smooth. Then how long did it take to get you to the quarantine hotel finally?
It was quite quick. The hotel was very close to the airport. I think we were driving for 15 minutes. What Peter said before, they insist on spraying this liquid on your luggage, and it happens several times. It's when you disembark the plane, and then in the airport, and when you get into the car, and when you disembark the car, and you go into the hotel, and it's just this a massive amount of spraying. So don't bring your nicest suitcase to China, would be my advice. And if you have any, I had a water bottle, for example, make sure you grab it before they can spray this thing on anything that's drinkable or eatable.
You've actually quite lucky, as I mentioned at the beginning, the policy change. It reduced from 14+7 to 7+3 days. So you, as you landed in a different city than your residence city, so you need to quarantine the hotel for 10 days, 7+3, 10 days. Yeah, when you get to the quarantine hotel, how did the process go? Like, what did you do in the 10 days? Anything you did to keep your spirit up, stay positive, like that?
Well, arriving at the hotel, then we needed to put full hazmat suits on and cover our heads and everything. So that's a bit of an unusual experience. And then you check in, and we were staying in a very nice hotel on the beach. With big balconies and
could you go out on the balcony?
Yes, we spent most of the day on the balcony.
Oh my God!
But it's true. I mean, I was there last year for 21 days, which is really, really long. So I don't, even if we only do 10, I don't think we can call it lucky, because compared to any other place, it's still a very long and tedious process. And even if it was smooth at the airport, still sitting in the plane for 1 hour when you arrive and spending 4 or 5 hours in an airport, even if it works well with the stations, it's not a normal thing to do anywhere in the world, but you just have to put up with it. And the stay in the hotel, I think, is quite okay. In our case, food was quite all right, and you could order from room service, quite nice, both nice food and wine and beer for those who want that. And
wow, we're all going to Qingdao next time. I think all the luck that I had up until arriving at the quarantine hotel had been used up, because my quarantine was not such a lovely experience. First of all, the hotel was super run down. Like literally, it looked like everything was falling apart. Like the chair by the desk, it just started every day, like it started to like one piece coming off at a time, and it was still quite dirty, and nothing really worked except for the AC, thank God, because it was very hot in Shanghai, and then I got bed bugs. Yeah, no, it was just not a very nice experience, and the food was terrible. Catering was provided by the China Eastern Airlines, so it was basically airplane food, but worse. But we could
order?
Yeah, we could, or we could not order like real like meals, but we could order from supermarkets. So we ordered some yogurt, some fruits, and so on, and we had prepared a lot. We went shopping before we got on the flight. It was fine. In the end, everything was fine. That's what you keep telling yourself. It will be fine. It's just temporary. It will be fine. I would have taken balcony in Qingdao any day.
Yeah, sounds good, doesn't it?
I was wondering, can you choose a hotel, Peter, in Qingdao, or is it like designated to you?
No, the German Chamber has negotiated with a couple of different hotels, and the one that people going to Beijing or northern China is very nice, and it has nice rooms and nice balconies, and the food's quite great. Plus the support is very good. They try to help you with any problems you have. But I should also add that on our flight there were 6 people who tested positive, and one of them was one of our a member of our family. And out of those 6, then they do retesting with 2 different laboratories, and luckily in our case that was a false positive, but all the other 5 were sent to hospital for at least 7 days and another hotel quarantine. So that is something that can happen. It does happen. So.
That must have been so stressful.
It was those 24 hours before we got the test result, which was negative in our case, which was those were quite stressful hours, yeah.
Did you guys also have an experience where the second from last day you had to do an obscene amount of COVID tests? So for me, I had to do 14. So I think 4 were from my body, so from my nostrils and my mouth. And then 10 were just like for my belongings. So I had to bring out my phone charger, the TV remote control, and then also I had to swab like 5 different areas in my room. Yeah, and it totaled 14. It just seemed obscene to me, like not expecting that.
No, that didn't happen to us at all.
We had the swabbing at the last day. They tested my coffee cup and my mobile phone. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard other people saying that as well, testing your belongings and the things you touched.
Yeah, I literally had to take the swab that you test with and swab the floor, because they wouldn't come in my room. So I had to swab the floor in front of them, swab the door handle in front of them, swab the side of the bed with it, swab the toilet seat with them, just like watching me to make sure I really swabbed it.
Yeah.
It's really surreal. They showed me like a piece of paper saying like what I had to do, and I kind of read it, and I was like, wait, what? And then they were like explaining. I was like, no, I can understand what the paper says. It's just like the logic of the like what you're asking me just is seems crazy. But
I think my coffee cup was actually cleaned. I had just cleaned up after breakfast, so yeah, it was strange. I never got the result of it actually. I would really like to know if my coffee cup has COVID or not.
Yeah.
So Robbie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I'd say that you keep a routine if you can. Do things to keep you busy. So I myself, I found some online classes and did them, and just kind of doing that in addition to work really helps take over the time, because it is really monotonous, and it is like it will take a toll on you mentally. So try and keep busy, try and keep a routine if you can.
Yeah, that's a very good advice. Get up at the same time in the morning and get things started and have a schedule and have your lunch at the same time and do your exercise, etc. So to have a scheduled day, particularly, as I said, this time it was easier because we're all together. But last year I was alone for 21 days, and then you really need to have your schedule to do things in a certain order. But we should add also, and none of us were affected, but of course in some cities it has turned out that due to COVID cases, despite the fact that the arrivals from abroad are kept in isolation in a hotel, they're still affected by lockdown rules. So people have arrived in Xi'an.
And Chengdu.
And their health codes have not turned green, so they, after the 10 days and after 20 days, they still can't return, and then they're advised to go to some other place, Guangzhou or whatever, and still have problems with health codes which is another problem once you're here and you've done everything you should and you're still not able to go home.
Yeah. But for your cases, it's all pretty smooth after your quarantine in other cities and come back to Beijing, and then you do the test in Beijing, and then that should be fine, right?
Yeah, so I had a slight delay just getting access to my Beijing health code. So I basically had a pop-up which just said, you're in quarantine. This pop-up will disappear the day after your quarantine. And so I couldn't see my code at all until after I'd exited quarantine, meaning I had to stay in Nanjing for a little bit of time afterwards. But overall, I mean, once you're out of quarantine, it's a much more straightforward process once you're sort of on the ground in China, I'd say.
Okay, that's good. Thank you all for your advice. I think our listeners will really benefit from this. In our upcoming annual report, European Business in China Position Paper 2022-2023, the European Chamber once again addresses the issue of international travel restrictions, which is having a negative impact on China's image in the rest of the world. Robbie, could you give a short preview of the position paper?
Yeah, of course. So the position paper is the Chamber's flagship report. It's published annually every September. And this year's paper has been put together over 9 months. It contains 41 working group, sub-working group, and forum-specific papers, as well as an executive position paper, which essentially outlines sort of the macro trends of the Chinese economy and the direction the Chamber sees it as heading in. It gives recommendations on how China can address its business environment. This year's paper has 967 recommendations, so it's quite the big paper.
It's getting bigger by the year.
Yeah, so if you find yourselves unable to sleep at night and need something to do, we have a 400-page paper for you to waddle through. And so really the main argument of this year's executive position paper is that there's been a shift in the thinking of Chinese policymakers, and that ideology is now trumping the economy. And so we really try to outline the drivers behind that, how we see that as manifesting itself, and then also the implications for business. So the paper will be published on the 21st of September. So yeah, I encourage you all to read it.
Okay, yeah, remember to sign up to the launch event on 21st of September and download the paper on our official website. And tune in China Dispatches for a few upcoming episodes on the position paper. That's all for today. Thanks to our guest speakers, Charlotte, Robbie, and Peter. If you like our podcast, please subscribe to our channel China Dispatches, share it on social media, and recommend to your colleagues and friends. I'm Ray from China Dispatches. Thank you for listening.